I'm Marilyn Hatton. I'm the Australian member of the coordinating team, and I'm very privileged to be introducing Kristina Keneally, who's going to be the moderator for this panel, which is such an important panel about breaking the silence. I've just read the bio in the program for Kristina Keneally, and it says that she is a feminist theologian, a Catholic feminist, and a former politician. Let me tell you that it understates completely the impact she had in Australia, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I was talking to her last night, and she said she was delighted to be here at Gospel, Gender and Global Justice, and particularly here in Philadelphia, because it feels a lot like coming home. You see, Kristina is a former American who abandoned the country of her birth after the US Catholic Bishops' Conference sent her as a delegate to the World Youth Day in Poland in 1991. There she found that the Vatican had helpfully put a like-minded, progressive Australian bloke named Ben Keneally in the dormitory across the hall from hers. Kristina doesn't credit the papacy of John Paul II with much, but at least he found her a husband. 3 years later, she migrated to Sydney. And listen carefully to this story. Kristina also describes herself as a former feminist theologian. After completing a master's degree on the Jesus-Sophia metaphor, she started a doctorate examining women's experience of sin and grace. Halfway through her dissertation, she got a call, not from God, but from a more earthly source, the Australian Labor Party. And in 2003, she abandoned the academic world for the political sphere. In 2003, she was elected to the New South Wales Parliament, and in 2009, she became the 42nd Premier of New South Wales and the first, and to date, the only woman to hold the job. Kristina left politics in 2012, and today she works in various roles as the mother of 2 teenage boys, as an adjunct professor and the director of gender inclusion at the Macquarie Graduate School of Management, and as a host of a political television show, To the Point, on Sky News Australia, and as a columnist for The Guardian, and also does a lot of writing in other journals. So you can imagine how delighted we were when I asked her would she come to this conference and speak to all of you. So I give you Kristina Keneally.
Thank you so very much, Marilyn, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. It is a delight. It is such an honor to be here among such committed, vibrant, faith-filled feminists. And can I thank, in particular, those Roman Catholic women priests who gave us such a beautiful Mass this morning. Yes, clap them. I agree. 20 years ago, I might have imagined that I would be speaking at such a gathering, but not via the circuitous route that Marilyn described. The Holy Spirit really does move where she will. Today, though, we're going to, as has already been acknowledged, break the routine of having largely female speakers to move to a priest panel. And I should note, of course, it is a male priest panel. We should call it as such. I don't know about American breakfast television, but in Australia we have these morning breakfast shows where we've got this ridiculous segment. They all have it. It's the new vogue, where one bloke moderates a discussion between 3 women. All of our breakfast shows have that in Australia at the moment. I find it ridiculous, as if, you know, we need women to have a man to moderate a conversation. I feel the reverse happening here, though, so I feel like both apologizing and being a bit excited at this power. But the reason we have made a panel of male priests, and I should say they'll tell their own stories in a moment, priests, former priests, their status. But we've done that for this session because for most of this conference we have spoken about women's experience. We've brought forward and brought life to women's experiences of priestly vocation, women's practice of liturgy, women's representation of the divine, women's interpretation of her story, and women's exercise of power. We have refused as women to be silent. Throughout history, women have suffered consequences for speaking up, and we've also reaped the rewards of women who have demanded to be heard. And women break the silence in the church often because we have to. We often get away with it, like the nuns on the bus, because we're often a step or two removed from the Vatican's direct control. Sometimes we even get canonized for it. Think of Catherine of Siena or Mary McKillop. But what of those of us in our church who can access ordination? What of those who can, if they choose, live their vocation without having to fight for it? What of those who are already somewhere on the rungs of the church's hierarchical ladder? They can, if they choose, live a life silently and undisturbed. Silence is a choice that the hierarchy of the church would like its priests to make. And the hierarchy, as we often know, exercises control and enforces silence through a combination of rigid orthodoxy, secretive practices, intimidation, and the threat of exclusion or excommunication. Right now in Australia, the federal government has instituted a Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. Retired Catholic Bishop Geoffrey Robinson recently gave some remarkable testimony. In a chilling and telling statement, where, by the way, he described Pope John Paul II and Cardinal George Pell in not very flattering terms at all. He gave them a full, frank performance review. He went on to condemn John Paul II's lack of a response, lack of urgency to child sexual abuse. Here's what the bishop said. What we got was silence, so the bishops were loyal to the silence. Like all of you, for many years, I have been engaged with what can be broadly termed the progressive movement in the Catholic Church. And probably like many of you, over many years, I've known many priests who privately cheer the progressives on, but publicly stay silent. These priests often walk a fine and dangerous line, fearful that sometimes one comment in a homily will cause the parishioner to report them to the local bishop and invite a world of pain. In the movie yesterday, Radical Grace, Sister Jean said, "We could lose everything for speaking out, but at some point, someone is going to have to take a stand." Today we're blessed to have with us 4 men who have taken a stand. At some point, something pricked their consciences where they could no longer look the other way. They could no longer stay silent. And today these 4 men are going to tell us their stories. I am also going to ask them a few questions, and I'm also hoping that you are going to ask them a few questions. We're going to celebrate their voices, and we hope to understand and gain from their experiences to help others, to help ourselves break the silence. I'm going to begin at my most immediate right with Tony Flannery, a religious writer, a redemptorist priest, a native of Galway, Ireland, who, in a piece published in 2010, expressed doubt regarding the transmission of priestly authority from Jesus to the priests of the Catholic Church, raising the possibility that the claim of authority made by a group of early priests was made on their own behalf. He was suspended in 2012 by the Vatican. I'll let him tell you his story. Tony.
So good afternoon, everybody. I have my watch here in front of me because I'm terrified of women. especially political ones. Yeah, I'm a Redemptorist, as Kristina said, and in fact, last Wednesday marked 50 years of my profession as a Redemptorist. I don't know whether at this stage that should be clapped or not. And if you ask the Redemptorists, they mightn't know either. Basically, I've spent my life as a traveling preacher, preaching missions, novenas, retreats, all that sort of work, mostly around Ireland. And as time went on in my life, I began to question more and more. Around 1990, I began to write. And that's one thing I have learned. You can get away with saying a lot in the church, but if you put it on paper, you're asking for trouble, as I learned. And it emerged in the beginning of 2012, really. It was, Kristina, when the process began with the Vatican. And over 8 to 9 months, I went through the most extraordinary process where I first of all discovered, when I was first made acquainted of it, I had already been accused, judged, and sentenced passed by the Vatican. And over the next 9 months, I never succeeded in having any conversation of any nature with them, any direct conversation. So through the whole process, the thing I object to most wasn't so much that they questioned things I was saying and writing. I think any authority is entitled to do that. But there is a proper procedure for doing these things. And the church procedure violates the most basic fundamentals of human rights. And that's my real difficulty with my procedure. In the end, without going into any detail, at the end of the 8 to 9 months, it came down to this, that I had to write and publish a statement saying that I accepted that women could never be ordained priests in the Catholic Church, and that I accepted all the moral teaching of the Catholic Church. So, in other words, I was being asked to write and publish something that was in direct contradiction to what I had been saying for years. And that was the bridge too far for me. Since then, I've been out of ministry. My Redemptorist colleagues in the congregation have personally been very supportive, but institutionally, they have kowtowed to the powers that be in the church. I think that's a fair comment. About 6 months ago, they initiated a further procedure at which the Superior General came to meet me and he said, things have changed in the Vatican under Francis. In the CDF, they're no longer, I presume you all know what the CDF is, they're no longer all of one mind. There are differences of opinion. We think that now, if you could get a theologian to write a more generalized statement for you, remember, get a theologian to do it, write a more generalized statement, you'll probably get away with it. Now, I refuse that, not because I wouldn't like to get back into ministry, I would, but it would have meant me going back into the same unjust process, and I will never again do that. So I'm not allowed to minister publicly as a priest for the last 3 or more years, and I expect that that will continue. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ray Bourgeois. Now, I just want to reflect, I mentioned in the beginning we all attended this beautiful Mass. Roy, did I say Ray? I apologize, Roy. Oh, thank you. We attended this beautiful Mass this morning. Apparently that can be described as a simulated Mass, which is something Roy understands very well. Roy was is, to use the term, laicized Roman Catholic priest, an American activist and founder of the human rights group School of the Americas Watch. He'll tell his own story, but he has been canonically dismissed, as I understand it, for attending the ordination of a female priest and attending a simulated Mass, amongst perhaps some of your other outspoken positions. Roy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's a joy to be at this historic gathering. I was ordained back in 1972 with the Marino community and assigned to our mission work in Bolivia. It was here where the poor and the oppressed became my teachers. It was here in Bolivia where I was introduced to liberation theology that gives hope to people, especially the poor, that calls us to the table as equals. It was here in Bolivia that I learned, coming out of liberation theology, that all-important word, solidaridad, solidarity. I later came home and became very involved in solidarity work here in the United States when we discovered the School of the Americas in our backyard, a military school that trained soldiers from 15 countries of Latin America responsible for the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, the rape and murder of the church women, the Jesuits, their co-workers, and the list goes on and on. It was in addressing this injustice for years when, after my talks, I was approached by often devout Catholic women who told me about this injustice closer to home, they said, in our church. The exclusion of women from the priesthood. What I heard kept me awake at night. And I realized the moment had come now to express solidarity with the women in my church, and really not to do so, as we have often learned, that when there's an injustice, silence is complicity. And so I broke my silence. And when I did, I poked that beehive of patriarchy when I called for the ordination of women, and really poked it when I attended the ordination of Janice Seversinska down in Kentucky years ago, one of the many women being ordained. It was such a joy to be there, hundreds gathered, such joy, and such a need for women priests. But needless to say, the Vatican did not share my joy, our joy. And the letter came warning me that I had to recant, or I would be excommunicated, expelled. This, of course, I could not. And I went to work. I just wanted to convince the Vatican and my fellow priests through the faith, logic, common sense, there was a problem here. First, a loving God created us all of equal worth and dignity, no exceptions. That God, we say as priests, calls us to the priesthood. So I began to ask the practical question, who are we as men to say that our call is authentic, but your call as women is not? And there was often silence, or I've got to go to a meeting. And then I tried just to be personal. I just would ask, if your sister, your niece said to you, God is calling me to the priesthood as he's calling you, I said, would you support them? And most said, no. And then I tried really to use a little humor, which always helps. And I would often share this little postcard put out by the Kelly Ann Brown Foundation. Thousands have gone out. It's a little girl, and the caption, "Who wants to be a priest?" Thinking this could warm the hearts, but it didn't. And lastly, I tried to use a little humor and gave out hundreds of the bumper sticker that simply said, "Ordain women or stop dressing like them." You know, maybe a choice. That didn't work either. And really, when it came down to after 40 years, the official letter came from Pope Benedict, just 5 months before Pope Francis became the Pope, and I was officially expelled. And I had never experienced that kind of rejection or hurt. But I must say, I've done some reflecting since then, and I just feel that this experience has simply given me a glimpse, just a glimpse, of what women, people of color, our large LGBT community, what they have been experiencing in the Catholic Church and other faith communities and in our society for centuries. And in my reflection, too, I've come to see really at the very core of the problem is this addiction to power. In our patriarchy and having been a member of the club for so many years, I was naive. I didn't realize how deep the sexism, the misogyny ran, how deep it was. And it's going to take a lot of work. And we have to keep doing what we're doing. And I'm so empowered and energized by this conference and what Walk and Wow have been doing through their website, the blogs, Kate in Rome going to so many meetings, the ordained lady, that YouTube that got hundreds of thousands of, yeah, it's all important, but Miriam last night brought back some happy memories. In 2011, a group from Walk and Wow went to Rome, and I was so thrilled to have been invited. It was such an honor. And while there, we showed pink smoke over the Vatican. Wow, it was just great, right in the backyard of the Vatican there. And then we marched and we leafleted, and then we brought over 50,000 petitions to one of the cardinals there. And then we went in front of St. Peter's Square and we held up the banners that said, "Ordain women. God is calling women to be priests. Sexism is a sin." And, well, the banners were confiscated. And they today remain in that police station. But Miriam and Aaron, executive director of Aaron, they were arrested, put in the police car, and I felt very bad because I wasn't with them. But seconds later, the police came and arrested me, put me in another car. And I must confess, I was very happy. And let me wrap this up. We spent, 3 or 4 hours in lockup. And I just want to say in closing, though, I think we need more of this, what I consider like that Rosa Parks moment. The man with the power, like in Latin America, as I saw it there, as the women's suffrage movement discovered, and of course the civil rights movement, those with the power are not going to give it up. Change will come from the bottom up, from us, from here. It's going to come from the bottom up. And what's needed, I think, in our movement today would be more actions. Continue to do what we're doing, but let's challenge in a very loving and confrontational way, though. Let the hierarchy, the patriarchy, know that there is a problem, and it's called sexism, and simply we're not going to remain silent. And lastly, in this struggle for equality, like Bishop Romero said, we can all do something and do it well. And Walk and Wow have been doing it well for 40 years or more. And what we have to do now is just use this conference as sort of a moment to renew our hope, to energize our spirits, and to just keep moving ahead, asking what more can we do to bring equality in our church and in our world. Thanks.
Thank you. It is one of my favorite sayings, power is never given, it always has to be taken. If we wait for people to give it to us, we'll be waiting forever. Our next speaker is Father Jack McClure, a precious blood priest, a priest who took 8 years out of the priesthood and then came back to it. Until recently, he was part of a leadership team at the Holy Redeemer Church in San Francisco, which has the distinction of being known as the gayest nation in the country. He described his mission in the parish as to be present, to be pleasant, and to love the people of God. His parishioners described him as not a yes man for the bishop, as someone who puts his parish first and who wants the church to have wide open doors. Father Jack, thank you for joining us.
Join me in a moment of prayer, just a time of quiet that we might calm myself. O Divine One, we are so grateful for the gifts you have given each and every one of us. Help me speak truth and with honesty, and open our hearts to know you in the welcome of all to the table of Jesus Christ, and in the leadership of our faith. Give us wise, wonderful men, women, to serve you and call others to be at your table with you. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to let Friday, Saturday, and Sunday readings guide me. I really believe that if we listen to the intersection of scriptures as they unfold in our lives, they have things to tell every generation and every one of us anew. Friday, as we gathered the daily scripture readings, included the story of Jesus going off to heal, and he was accompanied by Mary, called Magdalene, Joanna, wife of Chuza, and Susanna, and many others. So I'm grateful that you are journeying with me this day as I fail once to become complicit, and I really do want to speak truth. There's no doubt in my mind that you as a woman or a man or a desire, if God has tapped you on the shoulder and said he wants you to she or he, them, her, him, and them, to do something for us, I would accept that call from you. I believe that God is capable of that. Don't you? Obviously, we're here. And then the Saturday readings were of the sowing of the seed, and Tina came and told us a lot more about the seed than we really wanted to know. I want to be an art appreciation class next, I think. I think that the truth is told in the stories, and you know art is nothing more than stories. A picture paints 1,000 words. I think the stories of our church are told very clearly in our paintings that we have left, and all of the things that we're finding as we're doing archaeological digs and the discovery. And I think the gentleman who spoke prior to my coming to this table told us way more than ever was understood before, at least by me. And I really appreciate that. I've appreciated all the speakers. The gospel tomorrow, there was that silly question that they asked, who was the greatest? Which one of us is the greatest? I want to know, right? You have to put your ego away if you want to be a priest. You have to put your ego away if you really want to serve Jesus. Because I think that you become a fool for Christ. I think that's all of us are called to do that, and a willingness to step up. So the last thing he does, he receives a child, and he said, whoever receives one such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives, he receives not me, but the one who sent me. So that divine source of sending that we understand in Jesus Christ in the incarnation, in the indwelling story of God, our understanding is that that's now a part of our life. And I believe that in your baptism and in mine, what we share is a common call to tell the good news of Jesus Christ to the world. Everybody needs to hear it, and the fullness of God's reign in my mind is going to be peace. I appreciate every one of my Protestant brothers and sisters that shared that journey, every one of you that have told that story. I grew up in southern Iowa, the best little Methodist boy in town is what my mom called me, embarrassed me to death. I converted to Catholicism, and while I was teaching, literature changed my life, to Tale of Two Cities, To Kill a Mockingbird, Hamlet, things that I had to teach, and I think the conversion took place as I was teaching at the time. I went to the seminary, studied at the Benedictines, studied for Bishop Morris Dingman, truly a gentleman and truly a great bishop. And joined the community, Society of the Precious Blood, because I believed that the way that they lived was congruent with what I believed. My province, Kansas City province, believes very deeply in LGBT issues, very deeply in the dialogue that's going on. And the reason that I'm willing to break silence is it's a dialogue, and Pope Francis has asked us to have it, and I'm glad to be a part of it, and I'm proud to do that. My community has emphasis on preaching. My community believes that we are called to be a community of reconciliation. My sisters, I would ask you in the name of every man that has ever been on this earth to forgive us for the times that we have been inappropriate in using our power to control you. As a Roman Catholic priest, I would want to apologize for times that we, in our way of doing business, as described, have been so callous, unfeeling, unkind, uninclusive. I think any time that discrimination, any time that bullying, any time that that happens, it's wrong. And we have to stop it. And we have to stop it now. And so I'm really grateful for those who call our church to responsibility. We wish that we were better. We wish that we would do all of that. But in the name of the resurrected Christ, Jesus Christ, we do the best we can. And I am grateful to walk this journey with you. I am humbled to be on this panel with these three gentlemen who have given testimony to witness to how they believe and how they have stood up when I was quiet. I did runaway and homeless youth work for 8 years. I was married during that time. I left my community in 1981. I didn't leave to get married. I left because I felt that some of the discrepancy of the church was hard to live with. When I did runaway and homeless youth work, I discovered the issues of LGBT children, when they mostly were gay and lesbian, kicked out of their homes. I was in the Midwest, Kansas City. Parents told them never to come home again. I dealt with young girls that had been molested and bothered by a stepfather, fathers, men. We built a long-term group home for girls because we knew that girls needed a safe place to go, and that was before we finally learned that the offender needed to leave, not the child. And our church is slow to recognize those same things in the things that have happened. We had on the National Network of Runaway and Homeless Youth, in which I was a member and a representative of our region, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, we had issues that we would concentrate on every year. Sexism, the lack of response in the rights of women, homosexuality, that's what we called it in those days, our children that were gay and lesbian and needed a place. We also were concerned about rural children that did not have a place to speak. We were concerned about the Hispanic population. And of course, we were always concerned about the kids that were on streets without a home. Every one of those taught me that there were kids that were not being spoken for. And I realized that if I were really going to do something, it would be better to be a part of the system. And the way I would describe it, I rejoined my community, and they were very gracious in allowing me to do that. When I rejoined my community, I considered that I went upstream to stop people from throwing kids into the river that goes down to where they need. Well, the same is true for all of us. We all must call attention to those. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm very, very grateful. I hope that we have conversations that help every one of us be a better believer and a better servant, a better foot washer, because that's what God calls us to do. And I'm proud to do it with you. And pray for me, and I pray for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Jack. Our last panelist is my fellow Australian, Paul Collins, a man who was once described, this is true, a man who was once described by Mel Gibson's father as a fatuous nincompoop with a doltish grin. Paul Collins is an Australian historian, a broadcaster, and a writer. He's worked as a parish priest in Sydney and Hobart. He's taught church history and theology in Australia. And he is the author of the 1997 book, Papal Power, which was investigated by the Vatican for holding the view, amongst other things, that a teaching, in order to be considered church doctrine, must be approved by the sensus fidelium, that is the sense of the people, as well as by the bishops and the theologians. What a radical idea, Paul. Paul, tell us your story. What happened after that book?
Well, I know that you're all thinking that I'm the youngest guy up here. I'm actually the oldest. And I'm the one who's been on the road post-examination by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, longer than any of these guys. Well, you haven't had that yet, but longer than those other two younger guys yet. But my story is kind of peculiar. The truth is that I grew up in a corner shop. I know you used to have them in the United States. They're just these shops that sold everything, milk and cigarettes and sweets and, groceries and God knows what else. And it was open all hours. And I'm an only child. And I saw my parents, that what they modelled for me was absolute equality. In fact, really, in Jungian terms, I suppose, my father was the more feminine and my mother was the more masculine. She was a decisive woman, highly nurturant, very, very nurturant of her beloved son. But my father was a totally realistic man. His feet were on the ground. He could tell you exactly how much stock was in the shop every day. So I know now that I grew up in a situation where men and women were absolutely equal. They shared tasks, and there were no assigned tasks for gender, and it just seemed natural to me. I've been a supporter of the ordination of women publicly in the media in Australia for at least 30 years. And I actually first encountered this when I was working at Weber Centre with the Adrian Dominican sisters, who were very much on the screen yesterday, especially in the film. I actually knew Jean Hughes, and it was also at Adrian that I think I got a good lesson in actually working with women. Before that, I'd lived in a pretty much all-male environment, certainly an environment dominated by men. But working with women who, again, assumed equality, as my mother did, I think I learnt a lot of things, so that when I went back to Australia, it was simply part of my horizon that women, like men, were called by God to minister in the church, and that meant ordination. So I was well on the record. Then I got a job. One of the things I learned very early on, even in a religious order, was that financial independence was pretty important. If you had money coming in, you could give your superior a raspberry and get away with it. So I copped a job firstly as a producer and presenter on a weekly national television program which was produced by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And for my sins, in the end, I ended up as the director of religious broadcasts for the whole corporation. So I had a reasonable salary. I had a very tolerant provincial who inquired as to what my salary was, and I said that was commercial in confidence. Look, my order looked after me every inch of the way, and not a word of criticism do I have of them, and they've stood by me through thick and thin. And then after leaving that media career where I was described as a doltish nincompoop with a fatuous grin, or was it the other way around? A woman wrote a letter, and she said, in this letter when I was on television, she said, "How could a man with such lovely eyes be so cruel to the Pope?" Well, it was very easy because the Pope at the time was John Paul II. After I left that, I then started off on a writing career and subsequently have produced 14 books. But one of those books, which came out in 1997, was Papal Power, and it was actually just a kind of an offspring of a much more longer and detailed book on the history of the papacy. My primary training is as a church historian. At any rate, within 6 months of Papal Powers publication, the letter arrived, and of course it always comes, as Tony Flannery can tell you, it always comes from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to the Superior General of the Religious Order, from the Superior General of the Religious Order to the Provincial of the Religious Order, from the Provincial of the Religious Order to the Superior of the person involved, and then passed on. So I got the 4th level copy of the letter signed by one person, a gentleman called Tarcisio Bertone, is a Salesian, who was later, of course, to become the most incompetent Secretary of State since his predecessor. And you see, part of my problem with papal power was that I said things like that. I said that, for instance, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith employed second-rate consultors, second-rate theologians as consultors. I was in London not long after the congregation's letter arrived, and Margaret Hebblethwaite was interviewing me, and she said, was there anything that I regretted in what had happened? And I said, yes, I do regret saying they were second-rate. They're actually third-rate, which was quoted in the tablet, for God's sake. So, but what I discovered, the most important thing that I discovered in all of this, people, the media kept saying to me, because I made sure it was a media sensation, because how was I going to get revenge on George Pell for reporting me if I didn't make it a media sensation? They said, how will you feel when you're excommunicated? And I said, wonderful, because I have never felt more communion with the real people of the church. And that is true. I have never felt more in communion with the church. And the church is not Ray Burke in his, well, I won't refer to what Tina Beattie said this morning, outfit. The church is not those silly fellows. The church is us. And I have never felt so in communion with us. People flocked to help me. A federal court judge wrote and said, let me know anything I can do. Morris West, the novelist who was still alive at the time, called me, and he actually, Morris and I became quite good friends through this. And, I mean, people come to you. Sadly, in the end, I received the final notice, a little bit like you're going to be evicted from the house. The final notice came, and it was signed in this tiny, spidery little letter, Joseph Ratzinger. And it said that Father Collins has obviously shown no humility, and that unless he knuckles under immediately, he will be summarily dismissed. And my superior general, who was a lovely Irishman named Curran said to me, oh, no, Paul, you've got nothing to worry about. You know what the Irish are like. I mean, like Flannery, for instance. Nothing to worry about. I said, oh, yes, I do. So I resigned. Discretion was the better part of valor. And wasn't I lucky I resigned, because I then met a lovely woman. Yeah.
We can both credit our marriages to the Vatican, Paul. Well done. I mean, as you're thinking about breaking your silence, as you're thinking about speaking up to what your conscience might be compelling you to say, what type of mental calculations do you make? If I leave, there's not enough priests. Could I still be ministering to people, even within an unjust system, who still need a priest? What types of calculations are going through your mind?
I had a very interesting exchange with my Superior General, Michael Braille, a Canadian, who put exactly that point to me at one stage, when it got to the stage where was I going to sign this document or was I not? And he basically said to me, he said, look, Tony, he said, it's only a document. Stick your name to it. think of all the good you'll still do as a priest. Think of all the people you will help, all the masses you will celebrate, and sign it. It was very tempting, but the other side of it was, and this is what I was saying to myself, think tomorrow, having signed the document, will you be able to look in the mirror and like what you see?
Yeah, that's right.
I felt like I've tried to speak in a number of ways in the way that I've lived my life, but mostly I regret that so many of my sisters that have left the church and do not worship at the same table with me anymore because of their feelings and how they have experienced church. I want to share with you a letter I have, or an email that I received. Tom Fox is a wonderful man. I've known him since the 80s in Kansas City, and he came to Most Holy Redeemer. By the way, we're not really just a gay church. We're an all-welcoming church because we think that's what every church should be, not just all gay. But please know that. That's our desire. And certainly LGBT folks are a part of our community, and we love them dearly, but there's more than that. But anyway, my friends of my age, my colleagues, women that I'd worked with in different places and women I'd worshiped with and all of that. Anyway, this is from a friend, and she said, just finished reading an article in National Catholic Reporter about the outreach of Most Holy Redeemer. So proud of your involvement and know you are at a right place at a right time. The article is so interesting, it seems so logical, and yet others have to question their practices now in fairness to non-heterosexual men. As a woman, I find most organized religion not representative of what I know is true. So wonderful to see that Most Holy Redeemer is breaking old barriers. And that's what you're breaking, is old barriers. All of this is why my sisters aren't with me at table, and I miss them a great deal. And I wish that our table would be designed in such a way that all would be welcome. Everyone would be welcome. And so, complicity? I don't know. I thought about that. Tony, I wish I were as bright as you so I could be, witty and urbane, but we have...
You haven't seen me driving. I'm neither witty nor urbane. I think this comes back to something that actually you, Kristina, have written about, and that is the question of conscience. This is absolutely at the center of this question, and for me also at the center of the question is history, the stuff that Gary Macy was talking about, and that Krishenka's spoken about, the archaeological material, and Ali talking about Mary as priest. History, exactly as Gary said, gives you a perspective. So I've always come with that perspective. That is that I was very lucky also in the seminary that we had a silly man who eventually became a bishop, and he taught canon law. But he used to say the church is always taught. But he was followed by a wonderful scripture scholar who always used to say, but how long has the church taught this? And exactly as Gary made, people don't realise that bishops were only started in Rome, appointing them in 1918, or 717, sorry. So you come with that perspective, but you also come with conscience. And in the end, you have to be true to conscience. You have to say, I'm not prepared to cop it. If you're going to you're going to baptize women, that just says it all. Baptize, you can then share in the whole leadership of the church.
I agree.
And the early church had no problem with this. It had no problem. Leadership was shared between men and women.
Yes, thank you. What is the calling to priesthood by males today, and what is it about the priestly formation that may be contributing to this silence and to this ability to dampen their conscience? I consider some of this sins of omission, even, because they chose something here, and I'm trying to figure how that might fit with this.
There's this real awareness that, and many, excuse me, longtime fellow priest friends have told me that there is that fear. It's very real, knowing that if you do break your silence and really take a stand, you're going to get in big trouble. We know that. And it also involves, the fear involves, really having to deal with family. I remember when I really knew it was very close, the moment was coming. I drove to Louisiana, and I had to bring my family together. My very devout Catholic dad, who's elderly, my siblings, very traditional Catholics, and I just laid it out there. I had to let them know I was in trouble. And that is a risk, because often they will not give us the blessing, but I was very blessed to, then you have to deal with siblings. I remember my sister said, "You can't do this to Daddy, you're gonna break his heart." And well, I gave him the letter I sent to the Vatican, and really, it was grace at work. He gave me his blessing, said that God had gotten Roy out of Vietnam, out of Bolivia, out of El Salvador. He's going to take care of him now. And that meant a lot to me. I just wept. We all came together with the group, the family hug. And that was a blessing. But for some, it's not, the blessing is not there. And for many, there will be a loss of friends. I have friends who have left, and really, it's like some of the LGBT community. They are exiled. They are forced out. And so there's, and I just, we're all struggling to do what we can. And I know there's a priest, a good Trappist friend where I used to make in Georgia, Trappist monk. He said, he's 95, and he said he's really, he wants to support the ordination of women. He needs a little more time. And I wrote to him, I just said, please hurry, express the solidarity.
I am interested in knowing more about the rhetoric and the rationale for a male-only priesthood in your formation. That's a perspective you have that few of us ever have access to. And you've heard things, you hear things like, well, the problem really is there can be no reconciliation with the with the Eastern churches if the Roman Church starts ordaining women. So there are all these different arguments. And I think sexism and fear is one thing, but that's too simple. So I would always tell my students, no, you got to keep pushing. So what else is there in the rhetoric that you hear as seminarians and priests, and the rationale, besides just calling it all sexism?
And it is connected with the first question. I think what we're dealing with here, it's both a rhetorical, but it's also a form of, it's both rhetorical and it's socialization. There is an Irish woman who has analysed, I'm going to have to, Maria's her first name, but she's written a book, Oxford or Cambridge published it, on priest abusers in Ireland. Marie, can anyone help me? Keenan.
Mary Keenan.
Mary Keenan, thank you, Marie. I never know which to say. Mary Keenan. It's an excellent analysis of the socialization that occurred in the seminary. And that certainly happened. I think that some of us resisted that socialization because, as I said when I was speaking, and I perhaps joked in some ways about it, I'm quite sincere about it, because I was a very well-nurtured boy, and I had a very strong sense of myself. And I was always seen in the seminary as the guy, I'm the person who fought for morning tea for the students. That was a major issue, to get the priests, the professors, and everyone else could get morning tea, but the students couldn't. So we had to go on an empty stomach through the whole morning. So, listening to boring lectures. So, it's a socializing, but it's the use of rhetoric, and the rhetoric is based, at least in the old seminaries, and I think still is to some extent, based in the French spirituality of the 17th century. It's the spirituality of people like Jean-Jacques Ollier, who is the founder of the Sulpicians. The Sulpicians founded the first seminary in North America in Quebec, and the second seminary in North America in Baltimore. So you have this. There's a whole rhetoric, you're right about rhetoric, there's built around it. It's Christ the priest, it is the sacrificial Christ, modeling that sacrificial Christ. But For me, the rhetoric just washed over me, quite frankly. Australians are very cynical people because we're convicts originally. So, yeah, but the socialisation is, the other blokes should speak about this. That's, I think, the key.
I think when you're told not to think about something, that's what you think about. And I think we were told not to think about things, and Tina told us what happens when we don't think about things. I appreciated Tina's talk.
It was terrific, yes. Me too.
You think about what you're told not to think about. And most of the priests of my generation, I didn't happen to do that, went to seminary at 14 years of age. Emotional and
I did.
a lot of the emotional and social progression of their lives is pretty much of a 14-year-old in some cases, if you know any of those priests. I do. And then the other part is calling today. I don't know. I think it's a real clear understanding on those who feel called today that women are not going to be called. I mean, at least that's the attitude of many of the younger clergy that I've experienced, but that may not be what they're taught. I don't know. I'm not there. So I think that contributes to it a lot. And
Thank you.
I think if you're told something often enough, you begin to believe it. Watch that in our political world. Isn't that a disgrace? So.
You've all been touched by priesthood in some way, and you're all religious order, or you were religious order men, so you have a little more freedom.
Yes.
My concern is with the diocesan clergies. They don't have as much freedom. I think they're more afraid of their local bishop, also of their brothers ostracizing them. My concern is with the young ones, the newly ordained, and the kind of person that is on the path to ordination in the male seminaries. I find that they are antagonistic. Many of them have no use for women at all. And my support, and I've been working in diocesan and parish ministry for 36 years, comes from the older priests, the older diocesan priests, who maybe not have as much to lose. But I'm really concerned about the quality of the diocesan clergy today. And that relates to her question about what's going on in seminary. How do we dialogue with our diocesan priests who won't even open the door?
For the last 5 years, I've been working closely with the Association of Catholic Priests in Ireland, and I absolutely concur with what you're saying. The diocesan priests are in an extraordinarily vulnerable situation, and the level of fear and anxiety among them is enormous. And I know many, many of them in Ireland who deep down would agree with a lot of what Brendan Hoban and Sean McDonough and myself are saying in the association, but they would be terrified to lift their heads because of the consequences of it. And then the young priests, two things I'd say about them. The majority of them seem to me to be very insecure young men. And secondly, the majority of them seem to me to be gay. Now, what the consequences of all of that are and how all that works together to produce the attitudes that you mention, I'm not sure, but I suspect it's in there somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would say that there are a lot of younger men who are wanting to be priests that are really, really good and virtuous folk and really sincere about serving. There are some here I know that are preparing for priesthood that are in attendance. I'm hesitant to make too much of a broad statement about our younger priests because I just don't think you're capable of being a pastor until you're 50. And when you get thrust into that position, you don't know how to make decisions or live with the conflict or the consequences of what it means to stand in a very, very important place, a place of need for our parishioners. So there's that struggle. And I believe that it's a moot point because of what was said. We're on the verge of a new way of being. So.
Thank you.
Question probably for Father McClure. One thing I struggle with, I'm a queer woman and a feminist, is the lack of solidarity between gay men and women in our struggle in the church. Because ultimately we both are fighting the same battle, which is natural law and theology of the body and all that stuff. And yet it strikes me that the radical work that you're doing at your parish in San Francisco, you could not be doing work that radical for women, or you would be shut down. That's what strikes me. I find, and I have many, many, many gay men friends, it's easier for them to find a welcoming place in the Roman Catholic Church than for a woman that's fighting for equality.
That's right.
And
That's right.
So there's something very threatening about women's equality in a way that gay men is something that issue doesn't threaten at the same level. And I'm wondering if you have any insight into that.
I don't think in the parish in which I've been privileged to serve, and I'm not serving in that parish any longer, but when I was there, our desire was to have men and women be of equal status and did everything that we could in every way. Obviously, you're right, we could not break the whole bond and do the limitation. You are aware that in today's church, and most of the bishops are not allowing gay men to go forward. I know that you brought that up as an issue. I think those in my community would believe that if more gay men were priests, we'd have a happier group. But you know, the priesthood is across a section of, you know, that Kinsey scale is there's a reason why it's from one end to the other. And if you really function in your priesthood, it has very little to do with sexuality, regardless of what I think Tina suggested this morning, for me at least. It's about connection, and we want that with all people. I just don't think that women are going to be standing in that spot because it's the biggest challenge to white male supremacy. We're seeing it not just with white male in that regard, we're seeing it with our Latino brothers and sisters, we're seeing it with our black brothers and sisters. The issue of racism is certainly rampant in our communities, our world. Look at I don't know why it's such a threat, other than if you got the keys to the car, you don't want to give them to anybody else. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where it is, I think. And the keys to the car belong to a group of people that are controlling who else gets the key. Mm. So we're going to go to keyless cars next, and it'll be your fingerprint. So thanks for the question, though. I hope I got close. Maybe not. Anybody else?
I've been thinking deeply about the wonderful success of the gay rights movement, and when I heard Tony speak in New York last year, he was asked, what do you think is going to happen in Ireland? Everyone in Ireland knows someone who's gay. And since then, I've been thinking, do you think it would make a difference if everyone in every church knew a woman who was suffering from an unfulfilled call to ordination?
Great question. I love it.
I'd absolutely agree with you. And like the Irish referendum actually swung on that precise point. And I do think, far be it from me to tell the women's ordination movement how to work, because they're doing so superbly. But if we could put faces on the thing, and if, say, in a particular area or country or whatever, faces became familiar, and the stories of women who feel they were called and the pain, I think that would help it a lot, and it would take the threat out of it. So I think you're onto something very good.
Don't you think that we're at a time in our world when we need an equality of leadership? Certainly it's not an either or in male or female power or energy, but certainly an integration. We need women's ways of knowing in order to live peacefully. Certainly as a male model, we're very aggressive, and obviously it's not working. How many wars can we be in at one time, The ability to sit down and talk and communicate the willingness to love a child that's difficult to love. Mothers have given us examples of that where it's what we need to do. We need to love our children of our church, all of them, all of God's creatures, all of God's children. So we have to do women's ways of knowing is what I think. So.
I must say, when they passed that referendum in Ireland, I mean, I just was so, I just didn't think it was Catholic Ireland. But it really, really gave me so much hope, and I know friends, but in how it came from the youth. They said, we've got to talk to our parents, our grandparents, and it was a struggle. But what I'm reminded of, though, in this struggle, that we're all about for equality in our church, gender equality, LGBT equality, but I'm reminded how I'm filled with hope simply because of this. There were many who tried to stop the abolition of slavery, the right of women to vote, the civil rights movement, and including many in our church, leaders. They failed. It was not possible simply because these movements, like in Ireland and here and wherever, any movement that's rooted in love, justice, and equality is of the divine. We feel it's of God. It's unstoppable. And I feel great when I get discouraged and filled with a lot of anger. I deal with a lot of anger, as you do. But I'm reminded of what has happened in our history, what we can learn from other struggles. And I would want to say to Pope Francis and bishops and priests, you know, guys, it's over. It's all over. It's unstoppable. You want to hold on. No. You want to hold on to that power, that addiction that you have, but it's not possible. This movement, we will have women ordained, and why not, really come in and learn really about that word solidarity and break your silence. But I'm really filled with a lot of hope.
I speak as an Australian and as a former Roman Catholic priest myself, so I identify with a lot of things all the panellists said, especially that point Roy made about solidarity. I spent my 10 years of ministry in the Philippines, and I learnt the meaning of that word from Filipinos at my side, and the principle that we sometimes expressed that was what you see depends on where you stand. And Filipinos taught me that, and it's a lesson that I've run on for the rest of my life. I want to make a comment, and look, I speak with the ignorance of an outsider. I heard a report yesterday after the presidential debates from the Republican candidates was held, and we know the differences of opinions that many of them have, but one thing that was said that they are all united on is that if one of them becomes the next United States president, they have the power to revoke any legislation that Barack Obama has made. So at the stroke of a pen, according to this comment, they can revoke the Clean Air Act, the Health Care Act, and also more benign legislation towards asylum seekers. Now, that to me is quite frightening. My question, I suppose, centres around that, about being vigilant and how you maintain the strategic gains that you have made, because, look, I'm sure our four panellists have learnt this very, very well from the ongoing cycles, and perhaps you, Paul, could address this question. How do you handle personally and politically the capacity of the Conservative group to stage a backlash or a resurgence, so that the 3 steps forward become 2 steps back, or maybe 2 steps forward and 3 steps back? So, Paul, could you make a comment on that one?
Well, I've been involved in the environmental movement, as you know, Vin, for a long time, and that's one of the things we constantly see. That is, you gain something, but 10 years down the track, we're retreating from it. That's certainly been our experience in Australia. We had a Prime Minister, no longer, thank God, he was sacked a couple of days ago, who doesn't believe in global warming. So
I think his technical term is crap.
Yes,
He called it crap.
Well, that was the term. He used that term, but I mean,
He
I
did
know.
use that term.
Well, Kristina, for God's sake, Americans are very respectful people, and they don't. I've not used a single four-letter word since I've been here. But it's interesting that you bring this up, Vin, because I can still see in my mind's eye the woman who founded the ordination of Catholic women movement in Australia was a woman named Dr. Marie-Louise Ewer. She's the sister of one of my fellow priests, Dennis Ewer. Marie-Louise died of cancer at a fairly young age, and her Requiem Mass was celebrated by, I can quite happily name him, Father Chris Murphy, who I had taught in the seminary, and it was con-celebrated by the Reverend Sarah McNeil, who was an Anglican or Episcopal priest, who was running a parish in Canberra where we live. She's now an Anglican bishop, the Bishop of Grafton. This Mass was celebrated publicly. It was celebrated in the presence of the auxiliary Catholic bishop, who was in the congregation, and with the permission of the then Archbishop Francis Carroll, who said, "What I don't know, I don't worry about." We have retreated, that was 10 years ago. 10 years ago? Yeah, 10 years ago. We have retreated so far from that now that the type of thing that Roy has experienced, the type of thing that Tony's experienced, it's eternal vigilance. You never stop fighting these battles. And I mean, that's the only advice I can give. Keep your eyes open and your ears open and ready to kick when necessary.
Neither political party, neither the Democrats or the Republicans, nor the administrations or any of the work of the government is the people. That is not. None of the clergy or the hierarchy of our church are the church.
That's right.
You are the church. We are the church. And until we as a church, until we as a people in the United States of America take responsibility for what's going on and saying, I don't like it, I'm not going to support it, I won't encourage it, I won't accept it, it will continue to happen because we acquiesce to that.
I want to focus on the punishments that came from the Vatican because I'm very aware that there's a current move in the punishment of priest pedophiles to separate laicization from expulsion from the community so that the worst of the pedophiles are laicized but can remain members of their community. I wonder if that if that distinction was made in any of your negotiations, or as some of you said, the negotiations are really with your superiors. But was there a separation, a distinction between what is clerical, a clerical punishment, a punishment of laicization, as opposed to being expelled from a community? Just
Good.
Or there's also the potential of an entire community being punished for the actions of one member. So.
Connected to that, the letter I received from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, first letter from Cardinal William Levada, began by saying that I was causing grave scandal in the church because of my public support for the ordination of women. And the first thought came to my mind, and with so many others, when we hear the word scandal, we do not think about the ordination of women. And I, in my letter response back, I did clarify that and also reminded him and others at the Vatican that the majority of Catholics, I mean, since then the numbers have gone up. I just jotted down yesterday, a recent Pew Research Center poll reports that 68% of Catholics support the ordination of women. And I must say, I need that sometimes to remind me that we are not lone voices crying in the wilderness.
Yes.
We are not the silent majority, no. minority here. We are the majority of Catholics. We are not alone. They are the minority, really. We have been in the minority for many times, but not this time. And I did have to say, and I did write back, of course, and reminded him about this issue of scandal, and drew his attention, of course, to the sexual abuse scandal. In the United States alone, over 12,000 children raped and sexually abused by over 6,000 Catholic priests. At that time were not excommunicated, nor were there bishops who transferred them, knowing of their horrific crimes. They were transferred. This, of course, thanks to SNAP and Barbara Blaine and the good work they're doing, they're educating or reminding them about what's scandal.
One other thing we'd also like to do, though, in acknowledging women, and this is a good segue to that, is that we have acknowledged today these 4 men who have experienced silencing, excommunication, threats, for speaking out, for being true to who they were, for being authentic, for answering God's call and the prick of conscience that God sparked in them. I'd like to also ask that we acknowledge the women here today. So I would like to ask those women who have been silenced, who have been either excommunicated or put out of a community, or been threatened with excommunication or silencing, if they feel comfortable to stand and to stay standing while we acknowledge that we are all in communion with you.